Thank you, John, and it's good to see you and be with you. They gave me the easy topic to talk about, sufficiency of Scripture and Christian cultural engagement. The fact that you didn't laugh too much is probably a good sign. I am told that there are some brief outlines, and if you did not get one, if you raise your hand, someone will provide that for you. Well, as we think about our topic, I want to set the problem, or at least the potential problem that we're trying to think about. So, as has been mentioned in previous lectures, Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 1, section 6, says that all things necessary for, among other things, faith and life are revealed in Scripture. All things necessary for faith and life. So now imagine a farmer who is a serious Christian, and as a serious Christian, he believes that he needs to serve the Lord in everything that he does, and that means that he needs to farm competently. He needs to be a good steward of the land that he's been entrusted with. He needs to carry out his vocation to God's glory. He needs to be good enough of a farmer to be able to feed his family and support his church and to be able to do good things for the broader world by providing food. And yet this farmer who's a serious Christian, he looks through the Scriptures and he doesn't find instruction about how to farm competently. He's not sure if he should grow corn or pineapples. And he's not sure when he's supposed to plant and when he's supposed to harvest. And Scripture doesn't tell him about those things. And so perhaps our farmer wonders, is there something wrong with the statement in Westminster Confession 1:6? He believes rightly that his Christian faith and life requires him to be a competent farmer. And yet it doesn't seem that Scripture tells him how to do that. And so what is he to make of this? Well, the answer is no. There's no problem in Westminster Confession of Faith 1:6 that our farmer situation has exposed. But we want to think about why that is. How can it be true that Scripture doesn't provide instructions for effective farming for our farmer, and yet it is a book that provides all things necessary for faith and life? Well, one way to begin to think about this is with respect to this idea of what is necessary. What is necessary? Now, necessary here refers to what isn't available to us elsewhere. This is one way to think about this. I'm not saying this is the only way to think about this. But if something is available elsewhere, then it's not, strictly speaking, necessary for Scripture to reveal it to us. Now, farming, I take it, is not easy. I say I take it because I've never been a farmer, although I did try to plant a couple of fruit trees in my yard after I moved to California, and my ineptness indicated to me that farming is difficult. However, farming is the sort of thing that you can learn about by living in this world. Farmers can learn from their parents and their grandparents who may have farmed the land before they did. They can read books and articles on it. They can experiment, trial and error, and see what works and what doesn't work. There is a lot that one can learn about farming, about even becoming a competent and effective farmer, simply by living in this world and taking advantage of the resources that this world offers. Now, actually, something else that Westminster Confession of Faith 1:6 says provides us some insight here. So a little bit later in Westminster Confession 1:6, it speaks about the light of nature and Christian prudence. Now, the reference there is with respect to the worship of God and church government. So even for the worship of God and church government, there are some circumstances that we learn about from the light of nature, that is, God's natural general revelation, and Christian prudence, our perception, our understanding of that. So there are some things that we learn even about worship and church government from the light of nature and Christian prudence. This is kind of an obvious example. Scripture tells us all sorts of things about our worship, how we are to worship, the substance of our worship, but it doesn't tell us what time to worship. Should we have our worship services at 10 a.m.? Maybe we should have them at 3 a.m. Well, actually, the light of nature and Christian prudence, rather than the scriptures, tells us that 3 a.m. is probably not a good time to have our morning worship service. So if that's true even for worship, that the light of nature and Christian prudence are very helpful, then how much more for something like farming? And so we might say that it is necessary for a farmer to farm well as part of his Christian faith and life. He would be disobedient to the Lord if he gave no attention to farming well, if that was his vocation. And yet, there is no necessity for Scripture to tell him how to be a competent farmer. Now compare this for a moment, the example of our farmer, with the doctrine of salvation. How much of the doctrine of salvation does the light of nature tell us about? And the answer is nothing. Natural revelation tells us a lot of really important things about life in this world, but it tells us nothing about the gospel of Christ. One way I like to put it, there's a natural law, but there isn't a natural gospel. And so if we are to know anything about the way of salvation, Scripture is going to have to reveal it to us. That is necessary. It is necessary for our entire doctrine of salvation. Okay, so I'm still on my introduction. This is a long introduction, but don't take it that the introduction is going to indicate how long the rest of the lecture is going to be. There's a little disproportion here. But another thing I want to say for my introduction is that Scripture does not only reveal what is strictly necessary in the way that I've just talked about necessity. Scripture also reveals an immense number of things that are extremely helpful, even if not strictly necessary. So think about this example with me. Don't commit adultery. That is not strictly necessary to be revealed in Scripture. That is actually revealed in natural revelation. There is not a single person in this world, even a person who has never been exposed to the Christian Scriptures, not a single person who will have an excuse before God on the last day for his or her adultery. Even by natural revelation, every person knows that adultery is sinful and deserves the judgment of God. So strictly speaking, it's not necessary for Scripture to tell us, don't commit adultery. But is it helpful? It's very helpful that Scripture tells us this. It's a really important matter. We are very sinful. We have a strong tendency to distort the revelation of nature when we feel strong urges in other directions. And so it is immensely helpful that we have such a clear statement in the Scriptures about the immorality of adultery. But then you might think, well, if we have not only natural revelation, but if the Ten Commandments say don't commit adultery, Well, it's not strictly necessary for Proverbs to say all that it does with regard to adultery. You remember how Proverbs, especially the opening chapters of Proverbs, say so much about this subject. And in all sorts of ways, in these, with these wonderful images and little parables, trying to show us the folly of adultery. Now you may say, it's not strictly necessary for us to hear all that from Proverbs, since we know that adultery is wrong elsewhere. But is it helpful for us to have all those various sorts of warnings in Proverbs to help us understand the true nature of adultery as utter folly? Yes, that is extremely helpful. So Scripture tells us what is necessary because we can't know it elsewhere. And it also tells us many things that are really, really helpful, even though technically we can know these things elsewhere. Now back to our farmer for just a moment. Our farmer might say, well, it would be really helpful if Scripture would tell me if I should plant corn or pineapples, given my piece of land. And I guess that may be true, but God in his wisdom knows exactly how much helpful material is good for us. God is wise, and he knows exactly what we should hear, what we should learn from the Scriptures. And our farmer is going to have to learn to be content with what the Scriptures tell him with regard to his particular faith and life. Okay, now I want to move to what is point 2 on your outline, which is, I'm trusting that the outline I'm using for my notes reflects the outline that I gave to the people a couple of weeks ago, so I apologize if it doesn't. I think it does. Roman numeral 2 should be 2 ways to err. All right, so it seems to me if we take this question about the sufficiency of Scripture, and we're thinking about our broader cultural engagement, such as the farmer trying to be a good farmer, that there are at least 2 primary ways that we could make mistakes, big mistakes. So number 1 is this. We could err by not paying attention to what Scripture does reveal about a particular endeavor, and to rely exclusively on what we can know through our experience in this world, through the light of nature, through our own wisdom. All right, to say, well, look, there's whatever my field of endeavor is, there's so much I can learn about in this world, I don't really need to pay attention to what Scripture says that's relevant. That would be a major error. You might say this would be the sin of arrogance, thinking that something that God in his wisdom has provided for our help, that I don't need to pay attention to that. It would also be the sin of ingratitude. If God has given us instruction about some particular field that we are pursuing, it would certainly be ungrateful of us not to pay attention to that. But here's a second kind of error that we might make, and this is an error in the opposite direction. It is an error of trying to make Scripture say things about a topic, about an activity, that Scripture simply doesn't say. Trying to make Scripture say things that are not revealed there, that God in his wisdom has not spoken of in his word. I think we could say that this is the sin of discontentment. Rather than being content with what God has revealed in the Scriptures, we are trying to force the Scriptures to say something that they don't. And so if we are to do well in this matter before us, we are going to have to be on guard against both of these errors. And I want to move then to speak of what I'm calling in Roman numeral 3, three preliminary examples. So I'm going to spend more time with the matter in Roman numeral 4. But under Roman numeral 3, I would like to speak more briefly about three areas of life, or three areas of, you might say, broader cultural engagement. And I think one of the things that we would recognize is that Scripture says different amounts of things about different sorts of activities. That just seems really clear. And so let's take a few examples and see this. What about mathematics? Perhaps there are some mathematicians here, or certainly many people who have studied mathematics, even to some advanced degree. I think it's fair to say that Scripture addresses mathematics per se not at all. If you want to learn algebra or trigonometry or calculus, I don't know what proof text to put before you. Now, we could say that in general, Scripture says something's relevant to mathematics, like God made this world orderly. And that does, at a very general level, underlie mathematics. And I wouldn't say that that's not important and helpful for us to know. But in terms of actually learning trigonometry or calculus, Scriptures really themselves aren't going to help us. And yet we understand that, well, mathematics is the sort of thing that Scripture doesn't really have to tell us this. There's no necessity, not because mathematics isn't important, but because mathematics is something that can be learned from the resources that God has given us in this world and the minds that God has given to us. Not that mathematics is easy for all people. It's one of those things that people have very different aptitudes for, but it is the kind of thing that is learnable through the natural resources that God has given us. So that's my first preliminary example of something in which Scripture says very, very little and almost nothing explicitly. But let's take another area of life where things are a little more interesting, a little more complicated. I was going to use diet. I didn't know that Professor Pickard was going to, he's going to make some offhanded comments about diet, and he wasn't trying. I don't think he was trying to steal my thunder, because I don't know how he would have known I was going to talk about this. But what about diet? What we eat. Now, of course, what we eat, that is a concern for us in terms of our personal health. But I think we can talk about this as a matter of, in a sense, broader cultural issues because, well, there are a lot of social implications about how we eat. We are hearing a lot now about chronic illnesses in the United States and how much of that is related to the way we eat. How we eat has environmental impact. There are, of course, so many widely different theories about how we should eat. You can talk to different doctors or read different books, different websites, and you can have extraordinarily different ideas about what is healthy. And I take it that, I don't know what the date for this is, but I assume that there's going to be some Senate hearings on a certain nominee for Secretary of Health and Human Services, and probably some eating issues are going to be a hot political topic. And so the whole idea of diet is something that we think about both for personal and social reasons. Now, on the one hand, it seems that maybe it's not really necessary for Scripture to tell us how we should eat. There are, of course, many things that we can learn about food and its effect upon us simply by living in this world, by our natural resources. We can consult other people about this who have some expertise on this. Of course, as I said, you're going to get a lot of different advice, but There are theories out there. There are people who do serious studies of these things. We can learn from them. We can also learn from our personal experience. If you eat something and it makes you feel terrible, maybe you don't need a doctor to tell you you shouldn't keep eating that. Right? We can just learn by our Christian prudence that there are some things that are good for us and some things that are bad for us. So, yes, on the one hand, we say, look, it's maybe not that necessary for Scripture to tell us how to eat. And yet, on the other hand, you read through the Scriptures, and Scripture actually says a lot about food and about eating. Genesis 1 and 9 tell us about things God has given to us to eat. That's kind of interesting. We know that the Old Testament law had many dietary regulations. Amazing, in a way, how many restrictions that God put upon the Old Testament people about what they could eat. And now in the New Testament, those restrictions have been taken away from us. And we find a number of warnings in the New Testament about not submitting to people who try to put new dietary regulations on you, as if those have some kind of spiritual value. We know that there are a number of warnings about gluttony. Think especially about Proverbs. You might think about Paul telling Timothy that he should drink a little wine because of his health. He has a bad stomach. We find a lot about eating as just an ordinary form of human fellowship. We also find material about eating sacramentally. One of our 2 sacraments involves eating and drinking. And so you start thinking about that, and wow, Scripture actually has a lot to say about food and drink. So let's think for a moment about those 2 ways that I said that we might err. We might err by not paying attention to what Scripture does tell us. Well, Scripture does set certain boundaries. There are people out there who will tell you you ought to be vegans. Well, we can't be dogmatically vegans if God has given us animals to eat. If you think that you should be a vegan, you might have some other reason for that, for your own health. You can make that decision, but you can't impose that upon others. And you also, you might believe that you should follow the carnivore diet for reasons of health, but you can't impose that upon others as dogmatically because Scripture has given us plants to eat. And you might choose not to drink alcohol for one reason or another, but you can't be a dogmatic teetotaler, at least not if Paul could tell Timothy that he should drink wine because of his health. And so, well, we might also take Paul's warning and say, well, it is good. It is good to be concerned about what we consume for our health. We should give it some thought. So Scripture provides some boundaries. We don't want to ignore those things that Scripture has said and impose something contrary to what Scripture teaches us. But what about that second way to err? Well, in light of real health concerns that we have and conflicting claims about what a good diet is, we might really want to see if Scripture gives us some detailed way to eat. What about Ezekiel 4? Remember when God tells Ezekiel to take certain ingredients and make a certain kind of bread for him to eat? Maybe that's the key. Maybe that is the spiritual superfood that is going to keep all diseases away. And you can actually go to the store, at least certain health stores, and buy Ezekiel bread. Or what about Daniel 1? Daniel 1, Daniel refused to eat the king's meat and wine and ate vegetables. Maybe that's the key. Well, I'm afraid both of these examples are trying to make Scripture do what Scripture was not meant to do. God was not trying to provide a blueprint for every believer's diet. Scripture doesn't provide the way to eat that ensures our health, the godly Christian diet. And so we want to be careful not to fall off into any of these two extremes. Okay, how about a third preliminary example? In a way, maybe that second example wasn't overly hard, but there are some areas in which Scripture, areas of cultural engagement, which Scripture has things to say, and it's, I think, a lot harder than issues of diet. And I'm thinking here about the natural sciences. So all of us as Christians, at least in our youth, we learn some natural sciences, and there are many Christians, of course, who want to go on and study the natural sciences in some more detailed ways. And this actually provides a good example for us, I believe, of this topic before us. So on the one hand, Scripture, it really doesn't say anything about the natural sciences as we know them today. Scripture doesn't say anything about chemistry or about physics the way we think about chemistry or physics in a high school or university classroom. And again, we might say, maybe Scripture doesn't really need to say things about these subjects, because the nature of these subjects is that we learn them by this abundant measure of resources that God has provided in the world. We do experiments with the things of this world. We develop hypotheses. We test these hypotheses. Scripture doesn't really seem, it's not really necessary for Scripture to teach us about chemistry, physics, or other things. But on the other hand, as the natural sciences have developed over the millennia, scientists have proposed things that contradict, or at least arguably contradict, things that are in the Scriptures. We might think about the controversy centuries ago about whether the earth is the center of our universe, or maybe the sun is the center of our universe. Natural sciences were indicating it was the sun, and yet doesn't Scripture speak of the earth as the center of our universe, of our galaxy? Well, in more recent years, of course, we have issues regarding the age of the earth and the universe, regarding evolution. And this provokes a lot of serious questions about what exactly does Scripture teach that is relevant to the natural sciences, and how should Scripture shape the way we view the natural sciences and pursue these disciplines. Now, to my great relief, I have not been asked to address this, provide you with detailed answer to this question today. And of course, Christians have come to some pretty different conclusions about some of these issues anyway. And without trying to take any sides at the moment on these, I would suggest that it would be helpful for all of us, no matter what our particular views on some of these issues, to recognize that there is danger of error in both of the directions that I indicated earlier. There is a real danger that we have certainly seen abundantly in history about Christians who feel so satisfied with what they learn through science itself, through human learning, through the experiments and hypotheses on the natural world, that they feel like they can set aside any relevance of Scripture for the sciences. Science gives us the answers, or at least the latest findings of science tell us what we need to know. And, well, Scripture isn't a scientific book, so it really doesn't have anything really relevant to say about this. We can't go down that road. That is an error. whatever, well, Scripture isn't a chemistry or physics textbook, but if Scripture says things that are relevant for these disciplines, and surely it says some things relevant for these, then what it says is true, and that does need to shape the way that we pursue scientific inquiry. But on the other hand, surely there is also a danger of trying to make Scripture say more than it says. And just to use that old example, it's easier and safer to use older examples than more recent examples, I suppose. But most Christians have come to understand that, well, even though many of our forefathers in the faith thought that Scripture teaches that the earth is the center of our universe, it's actually not teaching that. And there is no contradiction with these findings of the natural sciences. And we recognize that maybe some of our ancestors in the faith, they erred in trying to make Scripture say more than it actually said. And we need to be alert to doing that in our own day. We need to acknowledge what the Scriptures do say, but also be careful that we don't try to make Scripture answer questions that we want it to answer, but which it actually doesn't. And so that brings me to Roman numeral 4, and that is the last topic here, which is politics, which I want to just think about in a little bit more detail than these last examples. Now, honestly, I can't remember whether I was told I was supposed to talk about politics or whether I told the conference organizers that I was going to talk about politics, but I feel like I need to do it now because it's in your program. So politics is a good but difficult example of this question that is before us. How do we think about the sufficiency of Scripture and politics? Well, we might ask first whether it's necessary for Scripture to tell us things about politics. Is it necessary? And you might think, well, Scripture, our experience in this world and natural revelation, they actually do tell us a lot about politics. Now, natural revelation, the natural law, which is at work in the consciences of every person, actually tells us a lot. It gives every person a keen sense of the just response to theft and murder and other sorts of violence. Not to say that no one suppresses that knowledge, but every single person has a keen sense by the light of nature that those things deserve a just, proportionate response. And in addition to that basic knowledge of justice that God reveals in this world, there's also a really long human history of political action and the consequences of them. So if we're willing to go back and read history, we can learn a lot about different kinds of political experiments and what kinds of results that they bring. And of course, in our more recent examples, just in our own lifetimes, each of us has lived different periods of time, but whatever our lifetimes are, there are many things to learn about policies and what comes about when they are implemented. What happens when governments try to institute socialism? Well, we kind of know what happens. And there are examples of in this world today that you can see. And it's not a huge surprise what's going to happen. What happens when governments print a lot of money? Well, it's not a real big surprise. We kind of know what's going to happen. If you take the police off the streets, what's going to happen? Again, not a really big surprise. What if you try to force liberal democracy on societies that don't want liberal democracy? Again, we kind of know what's going to happen. I was going to use tariffs as an example. I thought that's probably a bad thing to say. Now, of course, I don't want to be overly simplistic. Our societies are complicated, and cause and effect is not always, there are often multiple causes for effect, so I don't want to be overly simplistic. But there is a lot we can learn from our own experience and from the experience of human history. So you might say, on the one hand, it's not maybe necessary for Scripture to tell us a lot of things about politics, but would it be helpful if Scripture said some things for us about politics? Well, given the fact that politics is so controversial, since a lot is at stake in our political decisions, since our societies are so complicated, since every one of us is self-interested, and we have a tendency to promote our own self-interest over what is just, boy, it would be really helpful if Scripture would tell us some things and give us some guidance on matters of politics. So that brings me to the question, does Scripture tell us much about politics? Now you're waiting for my answer. Yes and no? Okay, I'm going to cheat. I think yes and no. Let me explain. On the one hand, there are a lot of texts in Scripture that say things about politics. Maybe not exactly politics as we know them, but politically related things. In the New Testament, there are several texts in the epistles that give some instructions about civil magistrates and how we as Christians should respond to them. There's a very famous text in the Gospels where Jesus speaks about Caesar. There are a bunch of texts in the book of Acts in which we find the apostles interacting with civil officials, and we can see how they engage them. We turn to the Old Testament. We find in the covenant with Noah in Genesis 9 really important instruction about justice and the enforcement of justice. If we're looking for insight about how do we live in a pagan world, in a hostile world, in our politics. I mean, the Old Testament has stories about Joseph and Daniel in foreign courts. We read about Abraham dealing with foreign kings. Now, these are just some examples. You can say, well, there's actually quite a few texts that say things that are relevant to politics. But on the other hand, there isn't a huge amount of public policy in these texts. They tell us some pretty important and interesting things. They make sure that we know that we need a justice system that enforces basic justice. We know that civil magistrates should punish evildoers and praise those who do what is good. We know that, at least in general, we should pay taxes and we should honor and pray for our civil magistrates. And yet that leaves a huge number of concrete public policy issues open. I mean, it just doesn't address so many of the things that we are interested in our contemporary politics. And this offers temptations for us in different directions. To go back to my proposal about different ways that we can err. Think about the first sort of error that I identified earlier. It is very tempting for Christians to ignore the clear things that Scripture does say about political life. I mean, to take one example, we know very clearly in the New Testament that we are to honor our civil magistrates. And how often do Christians ridicule our civil magistrates? I think about this once in a while, for all those who want to have a Christian view of politics and who want to find all this biblical instruction about politics in Scripture, who just ignore one of the very clear things that Scripture does say about politics. And if we're cynical, we might say, well, why would we think we would obey those additional things Scripture would say if they were there, if we ignore the clear things that are already there in the Scriptures? And so, God knows what is good for us to hear in the Scriptures, and one of those things is honor your civil magistrates. And we need to be careful that we actually do those things that Scripture tells us. But there's another sort of error then, that second kind of error that I was referring to, and that is trying to make Scripture say things that it doesn't about politics. And I think there are plenty of examples of this. There are Christians today in the Reformed community who advocate that the Mosaic law, the Mosaic judicial laws, ought to be the standard for our civil governments, our civil law today. And of course, those civil laws, those judicial laws, are there in the Old Testament, and they're there for a reason, and we ought to try to learn from them. But those were given to Israel as God's holy Old Covenant people to regulate their life together as a commonwealth. And they're not given to be a blueprint for our own civil law today. That's making Scripture say things that it was not meant to say. And if that might be, and might say, maybe a temptation on the right, there's also that temptation on the left. What about looking at all those many, many, many texts in Scripture that talk about concern for the poor? And that we as individuals and as churches ought to be very concerned and be of help to those who are in need. But there have been many Christians who have taken that and used that to say, well, there needs to be an extensive welfare system in our political communities. And that, again, I would suggest is, well, those texts are there for a reason. We need to pay attention to those texts, but to use that as a biblical mandate for the welfare state is trying to make Scripture say things that it isn't saying. And so where does that leave us? We need to wrap up this lecture. And I think I want to end by saying perhaps we should just be content to say that what Scripture has given us is sufficient. We can't bring our own agenda to the Scriptures with a predetermined view of what Scripture, or what is sufficient for Scripture to say in this area or that area. God is wise. God knows what is necessary for us to know and what is helpful for us to know. He knows exactly what is good to reveal to us. And we need to accept that by faith. We are called to live by faith, and that has many implications, and one of them is to trust that God knew exactly what he was doing when he revealed the things he revealed and didn't reveal other things for us. Let us be sure that we get right what he has revealed, not to set certain things aside that don't fit our agendas, certain things that are inconvenient given our particular cultural moment. Let us make sure we get the things that are in Scripture right, and then also use those other resources, the resources of this world, the resources of our human minds that God has given to us, and develop well-considered judgments about what is good, about how to understand different areas of life and how to pursue them for God's glory. But let's also be careful not to impose our well-considered judgments that are not in Scripture upon the consciences of our fellow believers. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing some of your questions this afternoon.